The fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran is under severe strain. President Donald Trump has launched what he calls Operation Project Freedom, a naval mission to escort commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. has deployed destroyers, more than 100 aircraft, and around 15,000 service members to the region. Some 20,000 seafarers and 2,000 ships have been stranded since the war began, according to the International Maritime Organization. Iran has issued a clear warning. Any U.S. force entering the strait without coordination with Iranian authorities will be attacked. The IRGC Navy has also published a new map of what it calls its zone of control. Iranian state media, meanwhile, claimed that missiles struck a U.S. warship near Jask Island. CENTCOM denies that any ship was hit. The UAE says it intercepted Iranian missiles and drones and reports a fire at an oil facility in Fujairah. Meanwhile, Pakistan continues its mediation efforts. Iran submitted a 14-point proposal calling for an end to the war within 30 days. Donald Trump says he's not satisfied with it. And in a development that has sent shockwaves through the transatlantic alliance, Donald Trump has blindsided NATO by announcing the withdrawal of 5,000 U.S. troops from Germany, a decision European leaders interpret as punishment for their reluctance to join the war against Iran. So tonight we ask the questions. Is this a real de-escalation or just a pause before a wider war? These questions and more will be put to my panel tonight in All 24 News Special. Hello there and welcome to All 24 News Special. And before we start the discussion, let's just follow this report by our own Salman Asib and then we come back to the discussion.
24 hours remain before the expiration of Washington's ultimatum demanding that Iran reopen the Straits of Hormuz. In a post on Truth Social, U.S. President Donald Trump warned that Tuesday will be the last day of power plants and bridges and all at once in Iran, signaling potential strikes on key infrastructure. As tensions mount around the Straits of Hormuz, Tehran is bracing under the weight of escalating American threats. Yet in the capital, resolve appears to outweigh fear. I don't think Trump considers anything beyond his own interests and the dollar transaction he is involved in. Moreover, this is someone who says one thing and does the opposite, and is not all committed to what he says. As our Maltese supreme leader also used to say, Trump is not someone who can be relied upon or engaged in negotiations or dialogue. Despite the palpable strain, daily life continues, but residents are adamant. Fear must not dictate their lives.
Trade and the economy are all tied to the Strait of Hormuz. It is all connected to that. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, or even if 2 container ships sink there, it affects people's cargo. Everything goes to the bottom of the sea. The markets will also be thrown into turmoil, and traders will be left facing serious problems. Let me also say this. He is not a normal person. Either he does not stand by what he says, or when he does speak, he makes no rational decisions. He does what he wants. He is such a person.
With the countdown to the ultimatum underway, Tehran reveals a resilient population determined to carry on despite growing uncertainty. Across the city, the message is clear. Iranians stand firm, convinced that no external threat should decide their fate.
And let's begin our discussion for tonight. Of course, we will be joined shortly by Professor Andrei Korobkov, but meanwhile, let me welcome here with me Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean and Professor of International Studies from California State University, Los Angeles. Good to see you, Professor.
Good to see you, Karim. Always a pleasure.
Thank you indeed. And always waiting for the other guests to join, let me welcome Mr. Basil Dueig. He's a Middle East researcher at ACLAD from Lisbon, Portugal. Thank you for accepting our invite.
Thank you, Karim. Happy to be here.
And of course, we're joined also by Professor Katerina She's a political science and geopolitical analyst from University of Skopje, North Macedonia. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation.
Thank you indeed. And now let's begin with you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. We have seen that this actually ceasefire that has been prolonged. Iran wants a 30-day end amid these discussions to the war, but Trump rejected it. Also, we see that perhaps there is no genuine or real path to peace. How do you see it from your end? Are we looking at something potentially that could actually bring an outcome or result, an end to these hostilities? Or maybe the United States is strategically preparing for something bigger?
It's a very, very good question, in part because you have, on the one hand, the President Donald Trump, who has the final say, who has led this war from the start until now. Additionally, you have in the background the Israeli pressure on the United States to continue to go to war and to find ways of how not to find a resolution. And the fact that the Israelis are attacking Lebanon, are doing another genocide similar to Gaza. This is their own words. They specifically said that they're going to apply the same strategy they used in Gaza. And you know what happened in Gaza. They're doing this in Lebanon. And that's also to derail any prospective ways, a progressive way to achieve a solution. This is definitely this is definitely a result of a lack of trust. I think the Iranians' proposal so far, particularly the last one, allows the two parties to know each other by proposing an issue very selective and allowing the discussion of security to be the last issue. As you know, the Iranians have been very flexible. So that on the one hand, it is contrary to what we've seen in the United States. And then, you know, the other thing is that Donald Trump today is also concerned about the 60-day war, the 60-day that the Power Resolution Act forces him to withdraw the troops if he doesn't do that. If he doesn't sort of declare, he doesn't show or ask for an extension. Well, this last 2 days, we start to hear about a new operation, and that's again and we are on a stage where we are going to see more likely a confrontation than a peace, and it's a different name. Just very briefly, by naming this operation a different name than EPIC operation from the previously. What this is consistent with Donald Trump's position that the war has ended. This weekend, he wrote a letter to Congress telling them that the war ended on April 7th, and we have entered a time of sort of a ceasefire. So there is no reason for him to ask for an extension or to do anything else. He's not responsible before Congress. In addition, as you know, he was advised, and Donald Trump can start a new counting, a new 60 days by naming the operation a different name. This sort of fits or could be an argument for a legal perspective, but it will not satisfy the eye of the public what's happening on the ground, because all along, you know, blockade by international standard is still an act of war. So what we were seeing resembles nothing to achieving a solution we are leading to I believe, to escalation. This is based on how the United States has acted in the past. We've seen the same pattern, more buildup, and then the impression that we are negotiating. That is a repeat what we've seen before. So that's where the world, I think, this is where the situation is leading.
And now let me bring Professor Dr. Katerina Velyanovska-Blazhevska and maybe bring the problem of Pakistan mediation to the surface. So Pakistan is mediating the ceasefire talks and messaging between sides. However, both Iran and the US appear to be waiting for the other, perhaps to weaken first. While Iran faces severe economic collapse and domestic strain, how do you see this situation? Is Pakistan's mediation a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, or is it, as critiques charge, a process perhaps designed to buy Washington time while the blockade continues to strangle Iran, where 1 million Iranian have already lost their jobs since the war began, and not to mention the food inflation, which is running at over 100% actually?
In time of instability and fragile international world order, there are some countries that can really put in this manner as a mediators. So Pakistan's role as an intermediary between Iran and the United States should be seen with cautious optimism. Why we are saying that? On one hand, it certainly reflects the emergence of alternative diplomatic channels beyond traditional Western-led mediation, which can be useful in moments of high tensions. Still, the both sides, Washington and Iran, still have fundamental strategic disagreements, particularly regarding sanctions, regarding regional influence, security guarantees, and etc., and they are still not easily breached. On the other hand, it is also likely a mechanism to manage the crisis rather than maybe resolve it. In that sense, this may not yet represent a true diplomatic breakthrough, but rather a strategic effort to buy time while both sides reassess their positions under continued pressure. Maybe we could say that in a short term, de-escalation toward addressing the deeper structural issue can drive into new conflict, but in a long term, we need to see a bigger picture of involvement of different international mechanisms, mediators and actors, I would say, to say that we are going to the right path, maybe to resolve this situation.
All right, let me just now redirect another question, but this time to Mr. Mr. Duaik. If you're with us, Mr. Duaik, the Gulf states are the ones actually absorbing the missile and drone attacks amidst all this mess. And of course, their infrastructure is taking the damage, not to mention the damage sustained at the level of the US bases there. So Iran is also under extraordinary internal pressure. So if we come to analyze the position of the Gulf monarchies now, do you think they are the ones paying the heavy price of this war that they did not choose actually to start? And are they becoming a collateral damage in a war driven by large powers?
Well, Gulf states did not choose the war, yet they are bearing the consequences. I believe that the Gulf states are in a precarious position, actually. They are squeezed between two sides. On one side, you have the US, which is considered an ally to the Gulf states, which did not think about any consequences of this war. And you're squeezed on the other side by a theocracy that have changed into a military dictatorship ruled only by the IRGC. So that's very important to see the distinction here that's happening. Also, something that's significant is that the consequences of this war, yes, they are tremendous, but they are asymmetric when it comes to the Gulf states. So let's dissect this down. So Bahrain, for example, is the most vulnerable GCC economy when it comes to the consequences of this war. Secondly, for example, the UAE faces the strongest and the greatest exposure to trade and investment sentiment. Qatar, on the other hand, is highly exposed through LNG. And we've seen, I think, a report by Bloomberg recently stating that Qatar in itself will have its GDP shrink by 16% this year because of the ongoing disruptions that are happening in the region. And the biggest player here, for sure, is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is actually the most insulated country when it comes to this war. However, it is not completely immune if this war drags on more into the future. But the main issue here, actually, if we look at it objectively and from a more of an operational point of view, we would say that the main issue is logistical currently and not fiscal. The thing is that if you cannot export your production of oil and gas, then you cannot produce anymore. And if you cannot produce anymore, you cannot make money anymore. And that's how that logistical issue will turn into a fiscal issue and a debt issue to the GCC economies in the future. So answering your question, yes, the Gulf states are the most vulnerable. Iran remains the side with the strategic leverage in this war. However, the world economy is the one that's bearing the price of this war.
So it is an international crisis that everyone is actually bearing the brunt of. All right, let's move on to another point this time. Perhaps we bring international law legitimacy. Here I ask you, Dr. Katerina, if we see perhaps the crumbling architecture of international order, which is not just in the Gulf. Let's talk about the European Political Community Summit in Yerevan, where leaders actually confronted what many see as a breakdown of the post-power international order. For example, we have Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, warning of a rupture across several dimensions, arguing that economic integration is increasingly weaponized and that global rules no longer constrain dominant powers. So while rejecting a drift toward a more transactional, let's say, an insular world, he suggested the next phase of order may be rebuilt from Europe, hinting at a relative decline in the US leadership. In the UK, Keir Starmer also echoed the same concern, noting that long-standing alliances are unusually under strain, and the cohesion that once defined them is fraying, and how governments respond now, he argued, could be the one that shape international politics for a generation to come. So my question, when a Canadian Prime Minister feels compelled to attend the European Summit to declare that the rules-based order must be rebuilt out of Europe, not America, are we witnessing the definitive end of the post-1945 international architecture? How do you see it?
Well, this is a very good question. International law and legitimacy is becoming very crucial nowadays. Why? Because somehow we live in a world that is constantly reshaping and changing. We have a weakening of the multilateralism. We have unpredictable multipolarity. And that means that small countries and medium countries definitely are having some issues with the legitimacy and the way the international law is having the applicability in this manner. If we are going deeper in the current situation, I would say that this situation raises serious question about the credibility of the rule-based international order. Why? So if actions are perceived as selective or inconsistent within the international law, particularly the UN chapter, it risks reinforcing the perception of double standards, and it's very important. So at the same time, we are witnessing a broader trend where geopolitical realities increasingly challenge legal frameworks. Maybe if I go a little bit deeper, we can talk about that major powers tend to interpret international law through the lens of strategic investment, which creates a gap between the legal norms and the political practice. So the issue is not only whether international law is being violated, but whether it is being applied equally. And that is where legitimacy becomes fragile. If we are analyzing the situation on a long term, this erosion of legal consistency risks undermining the very foundation of the international system, maybe in a point of making conflict management more difficult and reducing the effectiveness of the multilateral diplomacy. If we are analyzing the period after the Cold War, we were all facing with the globalization. After that, with the COVID, we had a period of deglobalization when the countries started to point more to the national interest. And now we are facing somehow redefinition of this situation. And hopefully the system will find the new way and mechanism of functioning with these all new challenges.
Dr. Hamoud Salhi, let me turn to you now. U.S. troop adjustments and strategic disagreements over Iran have raised European concerns about NATO reliability and burden sharing, with some actually allies limiting U.S. operational access. So, according to you, is NATO still a functioning alliance, or has it become a protection racket, perhaps, in which Washington punishes allies who refuse to join its wars? And when France, Spain, and the UK have declined to give US forces free rein to use bases actually on their territory for the Iran war, what does that tell us about European judgment of this conflict as well?
I think there is a reality that we should not forget, that since the establishment of NATO, it has been United States responsibility, or if you want, a United States that has been leading this organization. Without it, the Europeans have had or have nothing to contribute except budget to the budget, and even that before Trump wasn't at the level that was expected. So it is not surprising when Donald Trump came to power and he's looking at this from his national perspective. This week, for example, let's not lose sight that the United States is also gathering troops and believe strongly that the current total number of troops in the Gulf is not enough, despite the fact that the United States has over 100,000 of troops in the Gulf region. It also fits with that strategy, removal of the 5,000 from Germany to strengthen their the position in the Gulf. So there is, as our guest was saying, the geopolitical influence the decision. I mean, even when you look at NATO, when it involved in Libya, it was President Barack Obama that led that effort. It wasn't, of course, you had Sarkozy, you had other leaders, But the United States has always been on the front of this machine. And frankly, it was the United States that decided to extend the lives of NATO, which was initially designed specifically to counter the former Soviet threat, the Warsaw Pact. And with its elimination, there was no reason for this organization to exist. It was the invention of a new threat. In 92, the NATO summit declared that the new threat to Western civilization is Islamic fanatism. Later on, it's Russia, and it's all defined from the prism of American national interest. So what the United States is saying today, what they are saying, it is the opportunity for the European to take matters into their hand. They have the Organization of Security, the OECD, I believe. You have, and that's where it should be. The Europeans have to be having their own security. And one wonder, I mean, we are way past the Second World War, and Europe is still dependent on the United States for its security framing, for its all other things, including for NATO. So I agree with you, but I see this as a natural results of how this pact was established. And when you have a leader in the United States who doesn't seem to believe in that, who is concerned more about his own interests, that poses a serious problem for the Europeans.
Mm-hmm. And now let me welcome Professor Andrei Korobkov, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Middle Tennessee State University, and also the President of the International Studies Association from Nashville. Thank you, Professor, for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you.
Professor Andrei Korobkov, the U.S. has rebuilt military presence and retains major naval strength in the region. The debate is centering on whether current strategy reflects long-term planning or leadership driven by personal ambition by the president. So, with concerns about perhaps diversion of resources from potential China contingencies, the implication, public opinion, and near-term consequences may be taking a backseat to Trump's ambition to reshape the world. So my question, when Donald Trump, driven by such self-perception, is depleting munitions the Pentagon would need for a potential conflict, perhaps with China, is this a calculated strategic decision or perhaps an imperial vanity project?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, say that Russian European section of the International Studies of the whole association. Consider Trump, to say that people stop strategic goals, his tactics, that is motivated by considerations. Strategic line, Trump had in 2015 for the election that starting. And
Professor Andrei Korobkov, excuse me, but it seems that we're having a technical issue with the sounds because it keeps cutting out and it's really difficult to make out what you're saying. So let's just have the technical team call you back in order to fix this so as to listen carefully to your analysis. Meanwhile, I get back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. So you shared with me a very interesting article which I read on The Guardian. And based on that, I would like to know on what democratic basis is this war being continued when the president himself, by his own confidence account, no longer considers himself accountable to voters, but to history's perhaps emperors or conquerors, let's say.
It's a very, very interesting question, Karim. I think it's a difference in leadership and a belief in public opinion. What we have in the United States is that it's the president who frames war. It's president by Article 2 as commander-in-chief that he initiates or can go to war, can go to conflict. It is the president that decides whether to inform Congress or not to inform Congress, even though you have the War Powers Resolution Act that specifically state that the presidents must inform and take when the president is involved in conflict, that conflict should end at the 60-day war, 60-day of the war or the conflict. We haven't seen that, and we've seen how the president is able to use the political system to give us another round of military action, which this is where we're heading, by renaming the operation, by declaring that the moment the ceasefire was established, that the war was over. We all know, and this is the American lawyers, the other side tell you, a blockade is considered a military act, and therefore the war existed, and we have seen this. So it's the American system that has embedded in it these powers for the presidents to the presidency. And then, you know, we talk about the public, and yes, the public takes time to sort of formulate an opinion that will affect the choice of war. Or affect the presidency. The consequences are long term, and I know there are elections coming up, but the public is not decisive. It expresses its opinion today, and then it phrases tomorrow. And the fact that President Donald Trump, referred to this mission or to this operation as a humanitarian mission was designed specifically to frame this operation in a humanitarian term and not in military term, hoping that this will sort of change the perception in the public, and that's really where we are, sadly enough. At a time when you have all the social media, all the war is on our screens today, we still tolerate it, and we might feel bad about it, but we don't do anything about it. And the biggest chapter, not to bring it back to the core issue, is what happened in Gaza.
Perfect, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. And now let me move to Mr. Basil Duwaik. And since you mentioned what happened in Gaza, what's still happening actually in Gaza, we have Iran filing cases and submitted actually evidence to the ICC, but the court has no jurisdiction over the United States nor the Zionist entity, Mr. Basil. So when the aggressors in this conflict are operating with effective impunity, the US and the Zionist entity are beyond the ICC's reach. So what kind of message does that send about the state of international justice? Is the accountability gap perhaps not merely a Western problem, but a global one?
Well, the thing is that for the scholars and non-scholars, it is obvious that the international system is fractured. The fracture started with Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine on February 2022. And it continued with Israel's attacks in Gaza, its war on Gaza, its war against the Gazans, and with what many scholars have labeled this as a genocide in Gaza. So I would say that actually accountability is real, but it is uneven. And as your guest pointed out, justice is increasingly selective in this case. It's not because law is weak, but because enforcement is political. And I would like to remind our audience of an interview that was done with the ICC prosecutor. And he was asked, what did US Senator Lindsey Graham, which is a US Republican hawk, say about the ICC? And he told him on point blank that the International Criminal Court or the international justice system is made for Africa or Africans and for thugs like Putin. So it seems that Lindsey Graham and his cult of Republican hawks believe that the international court system, being the ICC or the ICJ or the UN or the UN Security Council, is made for weak states, is made for isolated leaders, is made for militia commanders, militia members, but this falls short with the Western Hemisphere, let's say, Europeans, Americans, especially North Americans, Canadians, nuclear powers, permanent UN Security Council members. So we get back to the same point that here justice is selective. There is real accountability because the ICC, the ICJ, those international bodies can actually issue arrest warrants, let's say. They can pursue some kind of legal framework to constrain people like Putin, people like Benjamin Netanyahu, who are accused of war crimes from moving around the globe. But it falls short of doing the most important part, which is actually punishing them for their criminal acts. So there is definitely a fracture in the international system. And I don't really think with the current Trump administration, with the current powers that are in Europe, because we've seen the rise of populism, the rise of nationalism, I don't really see how this fracture can actually be fixed, how it can be conceived, how it can be pressured, or how it can be brought back to what it is, what it was, basically. So I would say accountability is real, but it's uneven, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And staying with that thought, let's move now to Katerina. The question and that lies behind this selective, perhaps, treatment when it comes to applying international law. Perhaps we tackled it a little bit earlier, but then we see that this war is not only affecting the international law, but also actually affecting economy. And to get a concrete, perhaps, figures about what's happening, oil prices are highly volatile due to policy announcements and conflict risks, benefiting perhaps some traders while increasing costs for consumers and energy importing regions. So it's not just international law. Even when it comes to money and economy, this is being selective. Those who are perhaps close to the president in the White House are aware of what the president is going to say next, and probably find a gap there to make a profit. So when a presidential announcement can move oil markets enough to generate fortunes for well-positioned traders, and when the humanitarian gesture is dismissed by markets as unconvincing, who's really actually, according to you, benefiting from this crisis, and who is really paying?
Well, maybe I can also put some reflection to Europe and what is happening in the other part in the world. So firstly, we can start from the bigger picture. The general public is confused. If we are analyzing the current scenario with the ceasefire from April 2026, we are seeing that the most likely is that short-term scenario is not full peace, but managed instability, let's say like that. This will reflect continued ceasefire diplomacy, periodic violation, ongoing pressure tactics, alongside intense bargaining over the Strait of Hormuz, different sanctions, nuclear limits, different regional dynamic. If I put now some shadow to the Southeast European region or Western Balkan, I would say that from this perspective, this crisis is not so distant. What I mean, any escalation in the Gulf directly affects energy prices, inflation, migration dynamics, and even broader European security debates. For a smaller and medium-sized states, like my country, North Macedonia, for example, the key lesson is very clear. Regional conflicts today rapidly translate into global economic and even political shocks, I would say. So now, if I go deeper in the way of how Europe is dealing with the situation, I would say that Europe finds itself in a difficult position. It is economically exposed, but politically cautious. While the crisis directly affects European energy security and economic stability, the European Union lacks unified strategic leverage to shape outcomes on the ground, because European Union is now redefining herself in a way how should be more leader in the security. So from one side, we are seeing this as a strategic weakness, but not only in a security manner, but also in fragmented decision-making, differing national interests among member states, limited military autonomy, and etc. So in this manner, more or less, EU tends to rely more on diplomacy and economic tools rather than hard power. At the same time, Europe is also navigating its relationship with United States, and here we can see some limits in the independent action. All of this maybe highlight the ongoing gap between Europe's ambition for greater strategic autonomy and the current capacity. In some conclusion, in this manner, we can say that there is no absence from Europe or European Union. There is some influence, and of course, Europe is engaged but not decisive in shaping the direction or outcome of the crisis. It is more putting a shadow from side and like observer of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Let me get back to Professor Andre here. Professor Andre, we were talking about the strategy of the United States, if there is any. What do you think this is going to lead to, just to catch up on the question I asked you earlier?
Well, first of all, say that there is a constant misunderstanding. People pick up strategic goals of Trump, his tactics related to politics. Trump remained stable for the last years, since they were from 2050 and the election. They include, as we know, consistently living Europe, concentrating on the Pacific, number of other, again in the hemisphere primarily, the destruction of the existing global institutions, turned to the policy of containing China. In relation to it, making a deal with Putin to prevent Russia from sliding towards China. And a number of other issues in the framework of realpolitik and an absolute understanding of US sovereignty. While these postulates remained stable, Trump introduced three new elements during his second term. First, if he initially was telling Europeans, you are worthless because, well, you don't pay for your own security, you are economically weak and weakening. Then at the beginning of the second term, his Vice President Vance told Europeans, you are in addition to that our ideological opponents. And recently Europeans made Trump a real present when they refused to support him in the Gulf, and now he is telling them not only you are worthless and you are ideologically opposed to us, but you are also traitors and unreliable as partners. Deal with your problems on your own. Second change that he introduced during his second term concerns international institutions. If in the first term he was simply weakening them, now he is aiming at destroying some of them and the creation of absolutely new institutions like the Board of Peace, where the US would openly hold exclusive position and will be the only one possessing veto power. And third, and it was surprising, if in his first term he was emphasizing that he was against the use of US forces abroad, now we saw a limited invasion of Venezuela and extraction of Maduro, and then the beginning of military operation in the Gulf that had really catastrophic consequences, not for the US as such, but for Trump and for the Republican Party, considering the fact that price of gas in the US has increased already 50% compared to December 2025. It was $2.94 for gallon at the end of 2025, and today it reached $4.57 for a gallon, roughly 3.5 liters of gas, and it leads to a complete panic within the Republican establishment and the increasing pressure on the White House to do something and to somehow end this war that really became an internal political disaster. In a situation when 90% of America's residents in general practically never pay attention to foreign policy issues. But when it hits on their pockets, they do get involved. And this is exactly the situation. And this has put Trump really into a dead-end situation, because any attempt to resolve this crisis with an additional use of force would lead to the further rise in the prices of oil and gasoline in the US. And Iran, of course, knows it very, very well, that, Trump in reality cannot use force on a massive scale because it would be counterproductive from the point of view of his internal political.
Mm-hmm. But then, Professor Andrei Korobkov, I asked this question earlier to Dr. Katerina, and was wondering who is really paying the price for this war when we see that every announcement, every tweet, every statement on social media, Truth Social to be precise, by Donald Trump, we see the markets actually reacting, and this can be benefiting for some people who are close to the White House, who are aware of what the president is going to say next, and they are making actually profit out of it. So what or how do you read this situation, and who is really paying heavily for this war?
Well, any war makes somebody rich. There is nothing unusual here. There is no difference between this war or any other war. Trump has very serious political ambitions. He wants really to leave a trace in history by changing US foreign policy, and especially by introducing internal systemic reforms. And this for him is much more important than, somebody making money out of it. But we saw the first casualty today. It's the Spirit airline that de facto went bankrupt. And this is not the end of story. The paradox is that before the beginning of this war, economic situation in the US was pretty good, and basically Republicans' prospects were also pretty good. And then the war came, and the irony is that the economic situation remains pretty stable still. Unemployment 4.3%. The expected GDP growth this year 1.6%, not high, but it's not a decline. But because it hurts, first of all, the prices of energy and specifically gasoline, it is highly visible. And respectively, the majority of the population, with the help, of course, of the liberal media, think that, their economic well-being is seriously hurt. And we already see the impact of this situation on the primaries, both Republican and Democratic. And as I said, there is a real panic among Republican functionaries, among Republican candidates for Congress. And respectively, there's a lot of pressure on the White House, but the White House cannot really do anything because any attempt to apply additional force guarantees that the price of oil would jump again. And Trump, ironically, finds himself in a very weak negotiating position. What he told Zelensky last year in the Oval Office, he told him, well, you don't have cards, is applicable now to him personally, because all the cards Trump has in reality would lead immediately to the jump in the price of oil and respectively to an additional irritation of the US electorate. And therefore, well, there can be a lot of rhetoric, promises of either ending the war immediately or vice versa, bombing, Iran into a stone age. But in reality, there is not a single good option right now for this administration.
Thank you indeed. And now let's close very quickly as we are reaching the end of this program for tonight. Mr. Basil Duaik, I begin with you. So uncertainty is dominating in this conflict. Options include perhaps prolonged frozen conflict, escalation perhaps through miscalculation or broader geopolitical realignment away from US-led order. How do you see it?
So let's just first point out that Iran and the US, looking at this agreement or these negotiations, have nothing in common. The negotiations are more of a media spotlight than it does not have actual material that both sides can work with. Iran is adamant that it will not include the nuclear issue until hostilities are ceased completely. And US is still negotiating with pre-war conditions. So I don't see any feasibility of an agreement here. Actually, Iran's attack against the UAE today is a precursor for another round of conflict. And I agree with the doctor that said calling this Project Freedom signals another operation away from Operation Epic Fury, which is basically done. I think the most realistic scenario would be is likely going back to fighting. However, the real question is what kind of fighting? Will Trump actually wipe out Iran's power plant infrastructure as he previously threatened? Or will he put boots on the ground? Which escalatory path to be chosen is unknown. But what is certain is that this war is an ill-thought-out war with ill-thought-out consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Duaik. We are really tight in time here. Just to allow the others to participate, Professor Hamoud Salhi, how do you see it? But briefly, frozen conflict with periodic eruptions, or perhaps a catastrophic miscalculation that neither side wants, but neither seems actually able to prevent?
I think the biggest challenge in this is a third party, or the elephant in the room, basically Israel. And I think that is the biggest challenge. We are going to see some kind of limited sort of attack, military attack or whatever. But in the end, I think we have to reach a resolution. If it's not, I know it will take some time, but that's the only visible option. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, over the weekend warned all parties from the consequences, and he put it very, very specific. The stalemate is hurting people. Confrontation hurts more people. We have to come to a resolution, and that resolution, let's go through the negotiation. The way it's moving, we are better. We are a step better than we were yesterday, despite what's happening with this new operation.
And what about you, Professor Andre? Would you agree with the Canadian Prime Minister, who suggested in Yerevan that we are witnessing a world in which the rules-based order is simply rebuilt out of Europe because America has abdicated its role. Briefly, please.
Well, Trump definitely is revising the rules. For him, center of the world system has moved out of Europe. Europe now holds a secondary position. That's the first point. Second, he wants to move from the policy system of multilateralism to a system of balance of power of great powers, so to 19th century model, with the US holding, a special place even among these major powers. So in general, we do see essentially not even weakening, but the destruction of the system that dominated the world since 1947. Yeah, and it's quite deliberate.
Thank you, Professor Andrei. And finally, let me include Katerina. What happens next according to you? But briefly, please.
Yes, well, definitely this situation is not so easily to be predicted, but we should definitely mention that the ceasefire should not be confused with peace. It is a tactical pause within a much deeper strategic confrontation that is currently happening. And maybe the real question is not whether the ceasefire will hold for days or weeks, but whether the parties can move from crisis management toward a more stable security framework, because otherwise we are still one step from renewed escalation.
Thank you, and we have to leave it there. My thanks to Professor Belyanovska, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Professor Korobkov, and Mr. Duaik. Thank you so much for these sharp and honest insights. And tonight's picture is dark, a humanitarian gesture that the markets do not actually believe, a NATO alliance fracturing in real time as European leaders gather in Yerevan to contemplate a future without American leadership. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in to our channel, and until next time, have a good night.